Could this be a joke? The voice pierced the warm afternoon air, harsh and tinged with the condescending sting of teenage hubris. The 26-year-old lead technician, Kyle Kramer, who was the best in his class, kicked the helicopter's landing skid. His boot made a flat, disappointing thud against the olive-drab metal. On the otherwise immaculate Fort Holloway tarmac, the machine, a holdover from a bygone era, remained motionless and indignant. A dozen technicians in clean coveralls stood around it, their arms folded, their looks a mix of embarrassment and frustration. On portable tables, laptops running diagnostic software were spread open, their screens displaying green-lit system checks that all pointed to the same falsehood. It was all right. However, the UH-1 Huey, known as the Patriot Bell, would not start. The heat caused its rotor blades to droop like withered leaves. An elderly guy stood by himself a few yards away, his presence a silent protest against the technicians. Feverish enthusiasm. He was scrawny, his skin and hair a cloud of white from decades of wind and sun. He was dressed in a faded olive-green jacket and basic denim jeans, the type that had been out of style before the majority of those on the tarmac were even born. He simply observed, his hands in his pockets, his eyes focused on the chopper itself, rather than the busy technicians, as though he were listening for a secret it would not divulge. Lieutenant Wells, the officer in charge of the disaster, walked confidently towards the elderly guy. With the authority that came with being a recent graduate of officer training, his posture was straight, and his jaw was taut. "Sir, may I be of assistance to you?" he said. The title, sir, is a demeaning formality. The old man's eyes, which were a light blue, changed from the helicopter to the lieutenant, and he said, "This is a restricted area." They were quiet and perceptive, and had a depth that made Wells feel oddly exposed. The elderly guy added, "General Michael Elson sent for me," in a raspy, low voice. Kramer heard and strolled. The name's Eli Vance. Over, using a rag to remove oil from his hands. Eli's eyes strayed back to the Huey. "Vance, you're the guy the general pulled out of retirement. We've got a direct line to the manufacturers. Engineering department, 3 master mechanics, and a dozen certified avionics specialists here. What exactly do you think you're going to do?" Kramer sneered, tossing his rag onto a toolbox. "Look, we've been looking for 6 hours. The digital multimeter shows perfect continuity. The fuel lines are clear. The ignition system is getting power. Every sensor is online. The computer says it should fly because it's this old bucket." Lieutenant Wells crossed his arms, reflecting. Kramer's impatience. "Mr. Vance, we appreciate you coming down, but as you can see, we have the situation under control." A few of the younger technicians snickered, the contempt thick enough to taste. They saw a fossil brought in to consult on a fossil. Perhaps it was a publicity stunt, or perhaps it was a general's moment of sentimental madness. This was a day for cutting-edge diagnostics and precision engineering. Eli's voice said, "They're trained on glass cockpits and fly-by-wire systems. Even this bird is different. She has a soul. And right now, her soul is quiet." Kramer laughed curtly. "A soul? Okay, Pop. You hear that, guys? We don't need a spectrum analyzer. We need an exorcist." The crew laughed louder this time, but Eli ignored them and started to walk slowly around the helicopter, his movements methodical, almost ceremonial. The technicians watched him with a sort of fascinated disdain, as if they were witnessing a strange ritual from a primitive tribe. Wells muttered to Kramer, looking at a file on his tablet. "His credentials say here he was a crew chief in Vietnam." He said the word Vietnam as if it were ancient history, a chapter from a textbook. "A crew chief," Kramer repeated, shaking his head. "So he knows how to patch bullet holes and swap out parts in a jungle." Eli paused close to the portside engine cowling, staring at a particular panel, a tiny, barely perceptible plate just below. The main exhaust. He squinted, his head tilted, and said, "What is it? We're not in a jungle, Lieutenant. We're on a modern military installation with tools that cost more than his house." Wells asked, his tone heavy with theatrical patience. "See a ghost? Something along those lines? That access panel?" Eli whispered, pointing with a steady, furrowed finger. "Is it flush?" Kramer's eyes rolled and approached and touched the area, saying, "It's flush. Those bolts have ideal torque specifications. I looked them over myself. Its rear sensors are all green. Have you opened it?" Eli asked. "The diagnostics show no fault in that subsystem. Opening it would mean breaking a factory seal and generating a mountain of paperwork for a non-existent problem." Kramer shot back, his frustration boiling over. "There's no reason to open it." He gestured expansively at his array of computers. "The system tells us where the problem is, and it's not there." "Your system," Eli said softly. He fumbled with it for a moment, his old fingers not as nimble as they once were, and Kramer grinned. "What's in there, Grandpa? Doesn't know this bird?" "I do." He reached into his old jacket and took out a small, worn leather pouch. Scarred and stained, the leather softened by decades of use, the snap polished smooth from the touch of his thumb. A wand of magic? Eli did not respond. Instead, he merely gazed down at the pouch in his hands, and for a moment, the thick, damp air of Fort Holloway, which smelled of cordite and rot, vanished. He was 20 years old again, his bloody sweat stinging. His eyes, as tracers green and terrifying, zipped through the triple canopy jungle below. A pilot was screaming on the radio inside the vibrating belly of this same Huey. A co-pilot was slumped over the controls, and a half-dozen grunts were praying. A round had punched through the engine and cowling, and the bird was losing power. He crawled out onto the skid, the wind trying to tear him away, and from that very leather pouch, he had taken a roll of sealing tape and a stubby custom-ground wrench. The memory was gone as fast as it had appeared, leaving the ghost of rotor wash in his ears. He had braced himself against the fuselage and worked, his hands sure and steady, while the world fell apart around him. The heat was getting unbearable. The general's demonstration flight was supposed to have started an hour ago, with dignitaries waiting in a cooled viewing stand across the base. His pale blue eyes looked up, refocusing on the haughty faces of Kramer and Lieutenant Wells. He saw an old man with a shabby tool bag, and he saw the ghosts of the young men he'd kept alive. "We're still troubleshooting in no-start condition. The techs are running level 3 diagnostics now." "And the civilian?" "The one General Michelson insisted on." Wells looked at Eli, who was still standing quietly by the engine. "He's here, sir. He's observing." The radio crackled, and it was the base commander, his voice tight with controlled fury. "Status report, Lieutenant." "No change, Colonel," Wells said, struggling to keep his own voice steady. "Put him on the phone with the general now." The order felt like a slap. Wells walked over to a young airman who was part of the support crew, a kid named Peterson. Peterson had been watching the entire exchange with a quiet, troubled curiosity, not with the technician's derision, but with a profound, unshakable familiarity. Peterson snapped, "The colonel wants the civilian on a secure line to General Michelson." "Yes, sir," Peterson said, grabbing a tactical phone. However, he noticed Kramer's and the others' expressions as he got closer to Eli. When he noticed the contempt in their eyes, he thought of his own grandfather, a reserved guy who had repaired tanks in the Ardennes, but never mentioned it. His mind made a connection. This was incorrect. He gave Eli the phone, but he took a quick step back and used his own cell phone instead. The number for the general's direct aide, a major he had met at a briefing a month earlier, was located. By scrolling through his contacts, His intuition told him to do it, even though it was unlikely and a huge violation of protocol. On the second ring, the Major responded in a hurried tone. "Major Davies, Airman Peterson is here at the flight line." "Sir." With his back to the others, he spoke in a low, frantic voice. "Fort Holloway. I apologize for calling you personally, but this is regarding Mr. Vance, sir. How about him?" The Major's tone sharpened instantly as he asked, "Is he okay?" "He's all well, sir, but things aren't going well here. He is being treated like a senile by the lieutenant in charge and the chief technician. They're making fun of him. They won't allow him to get close to the plane. Their computers are what they're depending on. Furthermore, I doubt that the computers are aware of the issue, sir. This individual, he looks like he does, Vance." On the other end of the telephone, there was utter quiet. Peterson thought he was going to be court-martialed for a second. Then he heard the Major's voice, now turned away from the phone, the sound of a chair violently scraping back, and muffled shouting. "You must hear this immediately, General." General Michael Elson, a guy with a granite-carved face and 3 stars on his collar, accepted the phone from his assistant inside the air-conditioned command center miles away. He listened for 10 seconds as Airman Peterson swiftly described the incident of casual disregard on the tarmac. Already grim, the general's expression tightened into something dreadful. He didn't speak louder. He didn't have to. His remarks were icy, exact, and bore the burden of his whole professional life. "Major," he declared. Everyone in the room recoiled at the low growl in his voice. He looked at his assistant and said, "Get me Colonel Hayes on the line. Confer with him at the tower. At Holloway now." He then got me a car. "Personally, I'm heading down there." Turning to the gathered staff in the command center, he silenced his end of the call. He said, "For those of you who don't know," in a startlingly low voice, "Elias Vance is the man my officer and lead technician are tormenting on that flight line right now. In 1968, he retained 60% of the 1st Cavalry Division's Hueys in the air with the help of baling wire, discarded pieces, and sheer willpower. He was not referred to as a crew chief. His ability to make dead birds fly again earned him the nickname Ghost. It's not just a Huey, the Patriot Bell. His Huey was it. For more than 1,000 combat flying hours, he served as her crew chief. When he landed on a hot LZ under fire to rescue a pinned-down LRRP squad after both of his pilots were wounded, he was awarded a Distinguished Service Cross for his flight. He took a moment to let his remarks sink into the quiet chamber. He personally designed a modification in a tent soaked in mud, which is why that helicopter is so unique and the focal point of our vintage fleet. A change not included in any manual. "Get me that automobile, please." The anxiety was at an all-time high back on the sun-drenched tarmac. Eli Vance had just gotten off the phone with the general. A brief exchange of courteous, low-pitched murmurs that were inaudible to the others. He gave Peterson a slight, appreciative nod and returned the phone. He turned back to the helicopter after that. The absence of an instant lightning strike from the sky gave Kramer the confidence to move ahead of him. "Okay, you've had your phone call with your old war buddy. We're done here. The colonel wants this machine moved to a hangar. I can get it started," Eli stated with a smile. "Let me open that panel, please." Lieutenant Wells was at his breaking point. In front of his whole crew, a relic was contesting his authority. Before his eyes, his career flashed. An aging machine and a stubborn guy put a stop to a career. He decided. A dreadfully bad one. That's sufficient. His voice was dangerously loud, but well said. "A citizen is meddling with the military. Activity on a secure installation, Mr. Vance. Mr. Vance, I'm telling you to get off the flight line now." Eli remained still. He simply stared at the lieutenant. "I mean it," Wells stated, advancing till he was encroaching on Eli's personal space. His voice dropped to a menacing hiss. "I'll have you escorted to the base stockade for a thorough security. Check if you say one more word. Old man, do you understand me?" With the intention of physically turning Eli and dragging him away, he put a hard hold on his shoulder. It was the last act of haughty foolishness, the last irreparable overreach. It was the high-pitched squeal of tires, not the sputtering of an engine, that pierced the atmosphere. Only a few yards away, a trio of black command trucks screeched to a stop on the tarmac, their doors springing out before they had completely stopped. From the front car came General Michael Elson himself, a mask of icy rage covering his face. Colonel Hayes, the base commander, came behind him, his face white with fear. The technicians froze, gaping at each other, as though he had been scorched. Lieutenant Wells pulled his hand away from Eli's shoulder. His blood froze. A feeling of nausea swept through him. Michael Elson, General, did not run. He moved with a purpose and pace that was far more frightening. He ignored everyone else, as though they were inanimate scenery, as he strode over the concrete, his gaze fixed on Eli Vance. He stopped just in front of the elderly man in front of him, avoiding the astonished lieutenant and the terrified lead technician. The jacket was faded. General Michael Elson, the three-star general in charge of the whole area, brought his heels together with a loud crack in the ringing silence. With the most dignified and piercing salute of his lengthy and illustrious career, he lifted his palm to his forehead. "Mr. Vance," the general continued, his voice loud and clear enough for everyone to hear over the tarmac. Eli just nodded, his pale blue eyes flashing with a sad understanding. "It is an honor to have you on my base, sir. I apologize for the reception you've received." He seems neither astonished nor especially vindicated. He simply appeared exhausted. The general stayed alert but withdrew his salute. He turned his head slightly, his eyes moving over the dumbstruck throng of technicians before focusing laser-like on Kyle Kramer and Lieutenant Wells. The general said, "Let me make something perfectly clear to all of you," his voice fading to a lethally quiet tone that yet reverberated along the flight line. "This man is a living legend in Army aviation, and you have treated him with such disdain. This is Vance, Elias the Ghost. For his bravery, he has been awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, a Bronze Star with a V device, and 2 Silver Stars. As a crew chief, he has more combat flight hours than all the pilots on this base combined." He pointed at the quiet helicopter with a stiff finger. "The Patriot Bell airplane is more than just a piece of machinery. It's a monument. In order to save a downed recon crew in 1969 during a monsoon, Mr. Vance personally field-stripped and rebuilt her transmission in less than 12 hours. He modified the fuel flow regulators on this particular bird in 1970. There is a change that isn't and never will be in any of your computer programs or manuals. This upgrade made it possible for this Huey to carry more weight and fly higher than any other in the fleet. He flew in to remove us from a mountaintop we were about to be overwhelmed on, a modification that saved my platoon's lives. Back then, I was a terrified second lieutenant, and he was the most composed individual I've ever encountered." A tremor of surprise swept through the audience. Jaws were loose. The technicians, who had just been giggling, suddenly gazed at Eli with astonishment and intense embarrassment. Kramer appeared as if he were ill. Lieutenant Wells's face had turned ashen instead of pale. Unable to look at anyone, he was fixated on the ground. The elderly gentleman was more than a forgotten war veteran. They had been attempting to swat him like a fly, but he was gigantic. The general returned his whole focus to Kramer and Wells. His voice was hardly audible now. However, a yell was not as frightening as this. In this command, your haughtiness, your unquestioning trust in your technology, and your complete lack of respect and humility have brought shame to your uniforms. The only individual on the earth who was aware of every secret about this airplane was standing right here, wanting to help. You also put him in danger. He took a step toward the lieutenant. You touched him with your hand. There was no question. Generally, it was a verdict. Then a soft voice interrupted. Eli was the one. He had moved nearer and laid a soft, soothing touch on the stiff forearm of the general. They're decent guys, yet from another era. They have faith in their cries. They are not to blame. The only thing the bird needs is a familiar touch. More scathing than any rebuke was his sweetness. He was standing up for the same men who had made him feel inferior. He was more than a historical hero at that instant. He was a teacher who imparted a silent lesson in forgiveness and wisdom. The general continued to look at Wells for a bit, before nodding abruptly and barely perceptibly. He took a step back and sat on the stage. Ghost, she's all yours. Eli eventually unsnapped the snap on his tattered leather pouch as he moved to the side of the Huey. He did not draw a sophisticated meter or a diagnostic tool. He produced one strangely shaped wrench. It was made from an unidentified black metal and bent at an angle that no ordinary tool could duplicate. The globe flickered once more as his fingers closed around it. At Kessan, he was in a steamy improvised hangar where the air was heavy with the stench of hot metal and canvas. He was manually molding this same piece of steel on a damp stone and comparing its fit to a specially made bolt that he had machined himself. The key to the machine's hidden heart was his modification, the one that no one else was aware of. He had created a manual bypass for the primary fuel injector that was controlled by the bolt. No computer could ever know what to search for. Returning to the present, he grabbed the little access panel Kramer had thrown away. He turned the 4 bolts with the special wrench. No ordinary tool could have handled the effortless ease with which they came loose. When he took off the plate, a tiny, basic lever was hidden within a maze of cables. It was put in the normal position. He pushed it gently into the bypass position with a wrench tip. Softly, it clicked into position. With a practiced touch, he tightened the bolts and reinstalled the panel. Then he approached the entrance of the cockpit and gazed at the technicians, who were in disbelief. Someone is interested in Kramer staggered forward as he inquired, his voice as calm as if he were in a trance. To try her now? His hands trembled a little as he ascended into the pilot's seat. Muscle memory made his fingers glide over the controls as he proceeded through the startup procedure. However, when he pressed the ignition switch this time, the outcome was different. There was a sputter, a cough, and then the Patriot Bell's turbine engine roared to life with a roar so loud, shook the air itself. With the recognizable life-affirming whump 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 that was the pulse of a generation, the long, drooping rotor blades started to move slowly at first, then faster and faster, until they became a shimmering invisible disk that battered the air into submission. The impact on the audience was immediate. There was a spontaneous cheer. The young guy who had made the call, Airman Peterson, was crying. The technicians were applauding, their previous haughtiness giving way to utter wonder. Eli Vance just saw the bird he loved come back to life while wearing a faint, melancholy smile. The fallout was muted, but quick in the days that followed. Neither did General Michael Elson discharge Kyle Kramer, nor Court-Martial Lieutenant Wells. Rather, he implemented the Heritage Program, a new mandatory training program for all maintenance staff under his direction. It told the stories of the men and women who flew, fought, and fixed the most iconic pieces of equipment in each service branch. The focal point of the first module, which was about the UH-1 Huey, was a blurry portrait of Elias Vance, a young crew chief. Eli was discovered by Kramer, and a modest Lieutenant Wells in a little roadside eatery a few miles from the base, a week later. He was drinking a cup of coffee while seated in a window-facing booth. After a moment of hesitation at the entrance, they approached with their hats in hand. Mr. Vanswell spoke in a voice that was hardly audible. Eli nodded, looking up. "Mr. Kramer, Lieutenant." "Sir," Kramer said, his voice full of passion. "We arrived to offer our apologies. How we handled you, what we did. No justification exists. We were mistaken and conceited. We sincerely apologize." Eli examined their features, noting the sincere regret in their eyes. He pointed to the booth's vacant seat. "Sit down," he urged in a soft voice. "If you have the time, I might share a few stories about that old bird with you guys after I buy you a cup of coffee. We hope you are inspired by the story of Elias Vance." They sat, and as the afternoon sun streamed through the restaurant window, the old hero started to speak, spanning the generations with tales of bravery, inventiveness, and the quiet, unassuming valor of the forgotten. If you think these stories of silent bravery should be told, then subscribe to Veteran Valor for more stories that celebrate our soldiers. Like this video and share it with your friends.